The crash should have been a minor inconvenience. A billionaire heiress stepped out of her luxury sports car expecting to hand over a check, apologize, and move on with her day. Instead, she found herself staring at an old man standing beside a battered pickup truck worth less than one of her designer handbags. To everyone else, he looked ordinary. But what she didn't know was that this quiet stranger possessed something more valuable than all the money in her family's empire combined. Hidden for decades was a secret her late father had protected until his final days. A secret powerful enough to change everything she believed about her family, her inheritance, and the life she thought she knew. And before this story is over, one forgotten letter, one buried truth, and one unexpected friendship will force a billionaire heiress to choose between wealth and the truth. Money can buy almost anything: luxury homes, private jets, expensive cars, and influence. But there are some things even billions of dollars cannot purchase. Truth is one of them. This is the incredible story of Victoria Harrington, heir to one of the largest business fortunes in the country, and Elijah Brooks, an ordinary man driving an old pickup truck with a past nobody suspected. Their lives should never have crossed paths. Yet a simple accident on a rainy afternoon would uncover secrets hidden for more than 30 years, expose betrayals buried deep inside a powerful empire, and reveal the final promise of a father determined to protect the truth even after his death. What began as a minor collision would become a journey through loyalty, loss, family, and redemption, one that neither of them could have imagined. Victoria Harrington had spent her entire life surrounded by privilege. As the only daughter of billionaire industrialist Richard Harrington, she grew up in sprawling estates, attended elite schools, and traveled the world aboard private aircraft. Newspapers frequently described her as the future of the Harrington Group, a multinational corporation valued in the billions. Yet despite the wealth, Victoria often felt strangely disconnected from her own family history. Her father had died 5 years earlier after a brief illness, leaving her control of the company and an inheritance larger than most people could comprehend. Since his death, she had devoted herself to expanding the business empire he built, believing she understood everything important about the man who raised her. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Victoria left a board meeting frustrated after a difficult negotiation. Distracted by phone calls and messages from executives, she barely noticed traffic slowing ahead. Moments later, her luxury sports car slid on wet pavement and struck the rear of an aging blue pickup truck. The impact was minor, but enough to damage both vehicles. Annoyed and expecting a routine insurance exchange, Victoria stepped out carrying an umbrella. The truck's driver emerged slowly. He appeared to be in his late 60s, wearing worn work clothes and a weathered jacket. His face carried the marks of years spent working outdoors. "Are you okay?" Victoria asked. "I'm fine," the man replied calmly. "Looks like nobody got hurt." His reaction surprised her. Most people became nervous when dealing with someone recognizable from magazine covers and business news. This man seemed completely unimpressed. As they exchanged information, Victoria noticed something unusual hanging from his truck's rearview mirror, a small silver key attached to an old leather tag engraved with the initials RH. Her heart skipped. Those were her father's initials. "Where did you get that?" she asked immediately. The man's expression changed. For the first time, he looked uneasy. "That's a long story," he said quietly. "One your father hoped would never be forgotten." Victoria stared at him. "You knew my father," the man nodded. Better than most people realized. Before she could ask more questions, traffic officers arrived to handle the accident. The conversation ended abruptly, yet before leaving, the man handed her a small card. "My name is Elijah Brooks. If you truly want answers about your father, come see me." That night, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. She had spent years believing she knew everything about Richard Harrington, yet she had never heard the name Elijah Brooks. Company records contained no mention of him. Family archives revealed nothing. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. 2 days later, she drove to a modest property outside the city where Elijah lived. The contrast between their worlds was astonishing. Victoria arrived in a vehicle worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Elijah welcomed her into a simple home filled with old photographs, books, and memories. There, sitting on a wooden table, was the silver key. Without speaking, Elijah placed a worn leather box beside it. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents dating back more than 3 decades. "Your father trusted me with these," Elijah said. "He told me that one day, if the time was right, I should give them to you." Victoria opened the first letter. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Richard Harrington. As she began reading, her entire understanding of her family started to unravel. The letter described events from long before she was born. It spoke of friendships, sacrifices, and business decisions never mentioned publicly. Most shocking of all, it hinted that the foundation of the Harrington fortune contained a secret known only to a handful of people. Victoria looked up, stunned. "What is this?" Elijah sighed heavily. "The beginning of a truth your father spent years trying to protect." And with those words, a mystery decades in the making finally began to unfold. Victoria barely slept after reading the first letter. Long after midnight, she remained seated in her penthouse office overlooking the city skyline, surrounded by documents Elijah Brooks had entrusted to her. Every page seemed to reveal a different version of her father than the one she had known. Publicly, Richard Harrington had been celebrated as a self-made billionaire who built one of the most successful companies in the country. But the letters described a much younger Richard, a man struggling to survive, working long hours, taking risks, and relying heavily on a small group of friends who believed in him before anyone else did. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the letters: Elijah Brooks. The more Victoria read, the more confused she became. According to these records, Elijah had not been an ordinary employee or business associate. He had been Richard's closest friend. 30 years earlier, when the future billionaire possessed little more than an idea and a dream, Elijah had been standing beside him. The letters described long nights spent planning the future, borrowing money they could barely afford, and taking chances that could have ruined them both. Yet despite Elijah's importance, no company history mentioned him. It was as if he had been erased from existence. The next morning, Victoria returned to Elijah's home with dozens of questions. She found him repairing an old wooden fence behind his house. "Why doesn't anyone know who you are?" she asked immediately. Elijah placed his tools down slowly. For several moments he said nothing. Then he looked toward the horizon as if searching for memories buried decades in the past. "Because your father made sure nobody would," he finally answered. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Why would he do that?" Elijah sighed heavily. "Because some secrets protect people and others destroy them." He invited her inside and opened another box hidden beneath a bookshelf. This one contained photographs. In image after image, Elijah stood beside a young Richard Harrington. They appeared inseparable. They celebrated milestones together, worked in warehouses together, and traveled across the country chasing opportunities. One faded photograph stopped Victoria cold. It showed her father shaking hands with a group of investors during what appeared to be the company's earliest days. Standing beside him was Elijah. Yet someone had deliberately cut Elijah out of every published version of the same photograph. "Who did this?" Victoria whispered. Elijah's expression darkened. "Your uncle, Charles." Victoria felt a chill run through her body. Charles Harrington had taken over many executive responsibilities after her father's death. He had always presented himself as a loyal protector of the family legacy. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "My uncle spent years helping my father build the company." Elijah slowly shook his head. "That's what everyone believes." Then he handed her another letter. Unlike the previous ones, this letter was marked confidential and addressed directly to Victoria. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The date revealed it had been written only weeks before her father's death. Richard explained that he feared powerful individuals inside the company might eventually attempt to rewrite history. He warned that certain people cared more about control than truth. Most disturbing of all, he claimed that a crucial agreement signed during the company's early years had mysteriously disappeared. According to Richard, that agreement legally entitled Elijah to a significant share of the business. If the document ever resurfaced, ownership of part of the Harrington empire could change dramatically. Victoria looked up in shock. "You own part of the company," Elijah laughed bitterly. "Not anymore." "What happened?" Elijah walked to a nearby window. "The agreement vanished." Without it, there was no proof. Victoria immediately understood the implications. If Elijah's claim was legitimate, billions of dollars could be involved. But money seemed almost secondary compared to the betrayal being described. Someone had intentionally removed Elijah from the company's history. Someone had benefited from his disappearance. And the evidence increasingly pointed toward her own family. Over the following weeks, Victoria quietly began investigating company archives. Using her authority as CEO, she accessed records nobody had examined in years. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. Entire sections of corporate history contained gaps. Meeting notes were missing. Financial records appeared altered. Important files had vanished. The deeper she searched, the more it seemed someone had carefully erased evidence over decades. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading among senior executives. People noticed Victoria asking unusual questions. Some became nervous. Others attempted to discourage her from continuing. One board member even warned her that digging into old history could damage the company's reputation. Instead of stopping, Victoria became more determined. Then an unexpected breakthrough arrived. While reviewing archive storage documents, she discovered a reference to a private safety deposit box rented by her father shortly before his death. The box had remained untouched for years. Accompanied by attorneys, Victoria visited the bank. Inside the box, she found a sealed envelope labeled, "For Victoria, open only when the truth matters more than the fortune." Her heart pounded as she broke the seal. Inside were additional letters, photographs, and one small key. The accompanying note directed her to a forgotten warehouse once owned by the company during its earliest days. That evening, she drove there alone. The building stood abandoned on the edge of the city. Dust covered everything. Broken windows allowed fading sunlight to filter inside. Following instructions from the letter, Victoria searched until she discovered an old metal cabinet hidden behind storage shelves. The key fit perfectly. Inside lay a collection of original company documents untouched for decades. As she examined the contents, her world shifted forever. There, among contracts and agreements, was the missing partnership document bearing both Richard Harrington's and Elijah Brooks's signatures. The agreement clearly established Elijah as a founding partner with substantial ownership rights. But that was not the most shocking discovery. Attached to the agreement was a signed confession written by Richard himself. In it, he admitted that years earlier Charles Harrington had manipulated records and pressured him into remaining silent to avoid a public scandal that could destroy the company. Richard explained that he intended to correct the injustice before his death, but ran out of time. He entrusted the truth to Elijah and hoped Victoria would one day finish what he could not. Standing alone in the abandoned warehouse, Victoria realized everything she believed about her family's empire was built on an incomplete story. The fortune she controlled, the company she led, and the legacy she defended were all connected to a truth hidden for more than 30 years. And somewhere out there, powerful people would do almost anything to prevent that truth from becoming public. The moment Victoria decided to expose what she had found, she unknowingly started a battle that would threaten her position, her inheritance, and possibly her life. The secret was no longer buried. Now it was dangerous. The moment Victoria left the abandoned warehouse with the original partnership agreement and her father's confession, she understood that her life had entered a completely different chapter. For years, she had believed that her greatest challenges would involve business negotiations, market competition, and protecting the Harrington empire from outside threats. She now realized the greatest threat had been hidden inside the empire all along. The evidence sitting in her possession had the power to expose a deception that had remained buried for more than 30 years. More importantly, it could restore the reputation and rights of the man her father had trusted more than almost anyone else. Yet Victoria also knew something else. People who spent decades hiding the truth rarely surrendered without a fight. For several days, she told nobody about the documents. Not even the company's legal department knew what she had discovered. She spent hours reviewing every page, verifying signatures, comparing dates, and consulting independent experts. The results were undeniable. The partnership agreement was authentic. The supporting records matched company archives. The confession was written in Richard Harrington's own handwriting and verified by forensic specialists. Every fact pointed toward the same conclusion. Elijah Brooks had been a legitimate founding partner, whose contributions had been deliberately erased from corporate history. But proving the truth and surviving the consequences were two very different things. The first sign of trouble appeared when Victoria received an unexpected phone call from her Uncle Charles. His voice sounded unusually friendly. He invited her to dinner and insisted they discuss important company matters. Something about the invitation felt wrong. Charles rarely contacted her directly unless business required it. Curious but cautious, Victoria agreed to meet. The dinner took place at an exclusive private club overlooking the city. Charles spent the first hour discussing routine company issues before finally steering the conversation toward the past. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," he said casually. Victoria maintained a calm expression. "I'm trying to understand the company's history." Charles smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Sometimes history is better left alone." The statement hung in the air between them. For the first time, Victoria sensed genuine fear beneath his polished confidence. It wasn't the fear of a businessman protecting profits. It was the fear of someone worried that a secret might finally be exposed. She left the meeting more convinced than ever that she was moving in the right direction. Over the following weeks, strange events began occurring. Confidential files disappeared from company servers. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Certain executives suddenly became hostile. Anonymous messages warned Victoria to stop investigating. One evening she returned home to find her apartment had been searched. Nothing valuable was missing, yet several drawers containing research materials had clearly been opened. Whoever entered wasn't looking for money. They were looking for information. Victoria immediately contacted Elijah. Instead of appearing surprised, he looked concerned. "Your father warned me this might happen," he admitted. There were people who built their power on keeping this secret hidden. Victoria asked the question that had been bothering her for weeks. "Why didn't my father expose everything himself?" Elijah was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to a shelf and removed another sealed envelope. "Because he tried." Inside were letters written during the final year of Richard Harrington's life. The letters revealed a man struggling with guilt. Richard described years of regret over allowing Elijah's contributions to be erased. He admitted that fear, pressure, and the desire to protect thousands of employees had influenced his decisions. Yet as his health declined, he became determined to correct the injustice. According to the letters, he had begun preparing evidence and legal documents intended to restore Elijah's ownership rights. Then his illness worsened. Before he could complete the process, he died. Victoria sat quietly as she finished reading. For the first time, she fully understood the burden her father had carried. The company the world celebrated as a success story had always contained a hidden wound. Richard spent years trying to protect the business while simultaneously searching for a way to repair the damage. Now that responsibility belonged to her. The battle intensified when Victoria finally presented the evidence to an independent legal team. Their reaction was immediate. The documents were powerful enough to trigger lawsuits, ownership disputes, and potentially criminal investigations. News of the situation soon reached influential figures connected to the company. Within days, financial media began reporting rumors of internal conflict at Harrington Group. Stock prices fluctuated. Investors demanded answers. Board members called emergency meetings. Some executives supported Victoria's pursuit of transparency. Others viewed her actions as a threat to the corporation's stability. The boardroom became a battlefield. During one particularly tense meeting, Victoria presented copies of the original partnership agreement. The room fell silent. Several executives stared at the documents as if they were looking at ghosts. Charles attempted to dismiss the evidence as irrelevant, but every argument he made collapsed under scrutiny. Independent experts confirmed the document's authenticity. Legal advisors warned that ignoring the evidence could expose the company to even greater risks. For the first time, Charles appeared genuinely shaken. Yet the most dramatic moment came when Victoria announced her intention to publicly acknowledge Elijah Brooks as a founding partner. The decision shocked the entire board. Some feared lawsuits. Others worried about reputational damage. Victoria remained firm. "The truth doesn't become less true because it's inconvenient," she said. Her words echoed through the room. Outside the corporate world, public interest exploded. Journalists uncovered forgotten photographs. Former employees came forward with stories supporting Elijah's role during the company's earliest years. Historians reviewed archived records and discovered inconsistencies stretching back decades. Slowly, the narrative began changing. The man once unknown to the public was becoming a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and forgotten contributions. Yet despite the growing support, one final obstacle remained. Charles Harrington still controlled critical assets and possessed influence capable of delaying justice. He refused to surrender. Legal battles loomed on the horizon. Powerful interests remained determined to protect themselves. And as Victoria prepared for the final confrontation, she realized the ultimate decision would not be made in a boardroom or a newspaper headline. It would be made when the full truth was finally revealed before everyone. The empire her father built stood at a crossroads. One path preserved wealth, power, and comfortable lives. The other demanded honesty, accountability, and the courage to face painful truths. Victoria had already chosen her side. The question now was whether the rest of the world would be brave enough to do the same. And when the final evidence emerged, the consequences would change the Harrington legacy forever. The weeks following the explosive boardroom confrontation became the most turbulent period in the history of the Harrington Empire. News organizations across the country covered the story daily. Financial analysts debated the implications. Former employees came forward with forgotten memories, retired executives gave interviews, and historians began examining records that had remained untouched for decades. What started as a hidden family secret had become a national story about loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Victoria Harrington suddenly found herself standing at the center of a storm she had never expected. Every decision she made was scrutinized. Investors demanded answers. Board members feared uncertainty. Yet despite the pressure, she remained focused on a single goal, honoring the truth her father had spent years trying to protect. Meanwhile, Elijah Brooks watched the events unfold with mixed emotions. He had never wanted fame, power, or public recognition. For more than 30 years, he had lived a quiet life, carrying memories of a friendship that the world had forgotten. Seeing his name suddenly appear in headlines felt strange. Reporters wanted interviews. Television networks requested appearances. Publishers offered book deals. Elijah declined most of them. To him, the story had never been about wealth. It had always been about keeping a promise. Years earlier, Richard Harrington had trusted him with the truth, and Elijah had spent decades protecting it. Now that truth was finally emerging. As investigations expanded, independent auditors reviewed thousands of company records. Their findings were shocking. Evidence confirmed that historical documents had indeed been altered. Important records had disappeared. Certain individuals had benefited enormously from decisions that concealed Elijah's role in the company's foundation. While many executives had been completely unaware of the deception, others appeared to have actively participated in maintaining it. The public reaction was swift. Trust in several senior leaders collapsed almost overnight. Among them was Charles Harrington. For years, he had been viewed as a respected architect of the company's success. Now journalists uncovered a different picture. Archived communications, witness testimony, and financial records revealed a pattern of manipulation stretching back decades. The pressure became impossible to ignore. During a special emergency board meeting broadcast live to shareholders, Charles attempted to defend his actions. He argued that his decisions had protected the company from instability and preserved thousands of jobs. but his explanation sounded increasingly hollow as more evidence surfaced. When confronted with Richard Harrington's written confession and the original partnership agreement, he struggled to provide convincing answers. By the end of the meeting, the board voted overwhelmingly to remove him from all leadership positions. For the first time in decades, the truth faced no organized opposition. Yet Victoria understood that exposing the past was only half the battle. The future still needed to be rebuilt. In the months that followed, she initiated sweeping reforms throughout the company. Historical archives were restored. Independent oversight committees were established. Employees were encouraged to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, she announced a public recognition ceremony honoring Elijah Brooks as an official co-founder of the Harrington Group. The event attracted enormous attention. Thousands attended in person while millions watched online. As Victoria stepped onto the stage, she carried the same silver key that had first connected her to Elijah after the accident. Looking out at the crowd, she spoke about integrity, accountability, and the importance of telling the truth even when it is difficult. Then she invited Elijah to join her. The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Many people were emotional. Some employees cried openly. Others applauded until their hands hurt. For decades, Elijah's contribution had been invisible. Now the world finally knew his story. Yet the most powerful moment came when Victoria revealed her final decision. Acting on the authority granted to her as majority shareholder, she formally restored Elijah's ownership rights according to the original partnership agreement. The announcement stunned financial markets. Overnight, Elijah became one of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Reporters immediately focused on the enormous fortune he would receive, but Elijah's response surprised everyone. During his speech, he announced that a significant portion of his restored wealth would be used to create scholarships, community programs, and educational opportunities for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. "I spent my whole life believing that opportunities should belong to people who are willing to work for them," he said. "If this money can help someone build a better future, then that's where it belongs." The crowd erupted in applause once again. His decision transformed public perception of the story. What could have become a battle over money instead became a symbol of generosity and redemption. Over time, the company itself changed. Employees felt renewed pride in its mission. Customers responded positively to the transparency and reforms. Investors regained confidence. Slowly but steadily, the Harrington Group entered a new era built not on hidden secrets but on honesty. For Victoria, the journey changed her in ways she never expected. She had spent years trying to protect her father's legacy, only to discover that protecting it required confronting uncomfortable truths. Yet in doing so, she came to understand him better than ever before. Richard Harrington had not been a perfect man. He had made mistakes. He had allowed fear and pressure to influence difficult decisions, but he had also spent his final years trying to make things right. Through Elijah, he had left behind a path toward redemption. One evening, nearly a year after the accident, Victoria visited Elijah's home. They sat on the porch watching the sunset. The media attention had finally begun to fade. The legal battles were over. The truth was no longer hidden. For a while, neither spoke. Then Victoria smiled and asked a question that had been on her mind since the beginning. "If my car hadn't hit your truck that day, would you ever have told me?" Elijah laughed softly. "Probably not." Victoria shook her head in disbelief. "It's strange how one small accident changed everything." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes life has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be." As darkness settled over the horizon, both reflected on the incredible chain of events that had brought them together. A billionaire heiress searching for answers, an ordinary man carrying a forgotten secret, a friendship preserved through decades of silence, a father trying to correct old mistakes. In the end, the greatest inheritance Richard Harrington left behind wasn't a fortune, a company, or a collection of assets. It was the truth. And that truth proved more valuable than anything money could ever buy. The empire survived, justice prevailed, friendships were honored, and a secret hidden for more than 30 years finally found its way into the light, reminding everyone that while wealth can shape history, character is what ultimately defines it. The old truck was eventually repaired. The scars from the accident disappeared. But the collision itself became something unforgettable. The moment two worlds met, a hidden story emerged, and a father's final promise was finally fulfilled. Several months after the public recognition ceremony, life finally began returning to normal, at least on the surface. The headlines faded, the television interviews became less frequent, and the constant attention that had surrounded Victoria Harrington and Elijah Brooks slowly disappeared. Yet for both of them, the journey was far from over. One autumn morning, Victoria received a call from the law firm that had managed her father's estate. The attorney explained that a storage unit rented under Richard Harrington's name had recently been discovered during a routine audit. The unit had remained unopened for years because of a filing error buried deep within old records. Curious, Victoria arranged to visit immediately. Elijah agreed to accompany her. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of the city, forgotten among rows of identical metal doors. Inside the unit they found dozens of boxes containing personal belongings, journals, photographs, and company memorabilia from the earliest days of the business. Most items were ordinary keepsakes, but near the back of the unit stood a small wooden chest secured by an old brass lock. Attached to it was a handwritten note in Richard Harrington's unmistakable handwriting. "Open only when the truth has finally been told." Victoria's heart raced. Slowly, she opened the chest. Inside rested a thick envelope addressed jointly to her and Elijah. The letter was dated only days before Richard's death. As Victoria began reading aloud, the room seemed to disappear around them. Richard wrote about friendship, regret, loyalty, and the burden of carrying secrets. He admitted that building a successful empire had often distracted him from what mattered most. He described how fear of scandal had led him to make compromises he later regretted. Most importantly, he spoke about Elijah, not as a business partner, but as a brother. Richard confessed that many of the company's greatest achievements would never have happened without Elijah's sacrifices, ideas, and unwavering support during the difficult years when failure seemed certain. He thanked Elijah for protecting the truth when he himself lacked the courage to expose it. Then the letter turned personal. Richard addressed Victoria directly, telling her that leadership was not measured by wealth, influence, or power, but by the willingness to choose integrity when dishonesty would be easier. He explained that every generation inherits more than money. It inherits responsibilities. He hoped she would build a future based on honesty rather than image, truth rather than convenience. As Victoria finished reading, neither she nor Elijah spoke for several minutes. The letter felt less like a farewell and more like a final lesson from a man who had spent years trying to correct his mistakes. But there was one more surprise waiting inside the chest. Beneath the letter lay a detailed journal documenting the earliest years of the company. The journal contained stories nobody had ever heard, including the real struggles, failures, and near disasters that almost destroyed the business before it succeeded. Rather than preserving a polished legend, Richard had recorded the messy truth. Victoria quickly realized that the journal represented something extraordinary. It was a complete account of the company's true origins. Over the following months, she worked with historians, writers, and archivists to preserve the material. Eventually, a decision was made to create a public museum and educational center dedicated to entrepreneurship, ethics, and leadership. The centerpiece of the exhibit would be the story of Richard Harrington and Elijah Brooks, not as billionaire legends, but as two ordinary friends whose partnership changed countless lives. The project attracted widespread support. Schools organized visits. Business leaders funded scholarships. Young entrepreneurs traveled from around the country to learn from the lessons contained in the journal. Meanwhile, Elijah found unexpected purpose in mentoring future business owners. Rather than retiring completely, he began speaking with students and small business founders, sharing stories about resilience, patience, and character. His message was simple: Success achieved without integrity eventually becomes failure. People listened because they knew his story was real. Years passed. The company continued growing under Victoria's leadership, but its culture changed dramatically. Transparency became a core value. Employees were encouraged to challenge decisions openly. Leadership programs emphasized ethics alongside performance. The organization no longer celebrated only profits, it celebrated responsibility. One day, during the 10th anniversary of the truth's public revelation, Victoria stood before thousands gathered at the company's headquarters. Behind her hung a large portrait showing Richard and Elijah working together during the earliest days of the business. Looking at the crowd, she reflected on how everything had started with a simple accident involving an old truck and a luxury car. If that collision had never happened, the secret might have remained hidden forever. Elijah, now much older, sat in the front row smiling quietly. When Victoria finished her speech, she walked over and embraced him. The audience rose to its feet in applause. In that moment, the story came full circle. A billionaire heiress had discovered that her greatest inheritance was not wealth. A forgotten partner had received the recognition he never demanded. A father's final promise had finally been fulfilled, and a truth buried for more than 30 years had transformed countless lives. The fortune remained, the company endured, and the legacy survived. But the thing people remembered most was neither money nor power. It was the reminder that honesty may be delayed, ignored, or hidden for years, but sooner or later, the truth always finds its way home. And sometimes, all it takes to change history is one unexpected crash on a rainy afternoon.